The following presentation is based around the case of Clive Waring, a gifted musician who at the age of 46 caught a version of the herpes virus which attacked his nervous system and caused irreversible damage to parts of his brain, resulting in him suffering from both forms of amnesia and losing the ability to form new memories. Within the presentation we will be looking at the following areas. So the major structures of the brain and functions, the differences between the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and the two branches of the autonomic system, the difference between glial cells and neurons in terms of their structure and function, the process of communication between neurons, and the role of free neurotransmitters in relation to the behaviours that they influence. Now, when focusing on the major structures of the brain, we can further understand by looking at the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. First, we can look at the structures and understand their functions, and then apply the areas affected within the Clive Waring's brain and how this affects his everyday life. Now, the limbic system is in the middle of the brain, and it's involved with the processing of perception, memory, cognition, and emotion, and is made up of the following parts. So, the amygdala, which determines hunger, emotion, sexual desire, thirst, and fear response. The mammillary body, which is an information station between the fornix and the thalamus. It also works with the hippocampus and the thalamus in the processing of memory. Olfactory bulbs are smell processors and are a vital part of the limbic system that links our sense of smell with memory and emotional responses. And the dentate gyrus works to express an emotion and recall of memories relating to visual episodic memory. And the hippocampus is involved with the recognition of new experiences, learning, and the transfer of information via short-term memory. In 1991, Clive Waring received an MRI scan which showed extensive damage to the hippocampus, amygdala, and mammillary body, and the temporal poles. This explained why he showed symptoms of memory loss, confusion, damage to his STM, and his verbal and performance IQ declined. As the hippocampus is the area of the brain which processes new experiences and transfers them to the short-term memory, and the ability to learn and store that new information, shows why Clive's memory span was dysfunctional, as it was only lasting between 7 and 30 seconds, and he had no recollection of what just occurred. As the amygdala is a component of emotion and associated memories, this explained why Clive was unable to recall episodic memories prior to him getting the virus, and would also explain his lack of fear response. We'll now move on to the cerebral cortex. It's often referred to as grey matter. It communicates with the limbic system via nerve pathways from the central, peripheral, and endocrine systems to regulate and monitor hormone movement, which drives the motivation for most of our behaviour, and is made up of the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, cerebellum, spinal cord, and the temporal lobe, as seen here. The functions are complex, and the lobes interact with each other to and from areas of the brain in an integrated way. From the MRI scan completed in 1991, it could be seen that Clive also had damage to the left fornix and the left medial frontal cortex. And when a second scan was completed in 2006 and the two compared, it showed very little change. But from improved imaging, it was found that Clive had more damage to his left temporal lobe compared to the right, which can be seen here. The damage adds to the difficulties to Clive Waring's everyday life, as the temporal lobe controls the ability to recognise faces and objects, as well as controlling memories that are linked to information learned and facts. It is also involved with the ability to learn, recall verbal information, and the ability to memorise speech. This gives greater understanding and evidence to the importance of the function of the cerebral cortex, and explains why Clive could not remember big events in his life or memories associated. For example, Clive could remember and recognise his wife, but does not remember his wedding day or any conversations he had that day. It also gives evidence of the learning aspect of the cerebral cortex is involved with, as Clive, being a gifted musician and conductor, is unable to learn new pieces of music, but can play previous played music before his illness. From cognitive tests, the MRI scans, and the symptom Clive portrayed, it can be seen that the limbic system and the cerebral cortex both work together to process new and incoming information and integrate this with memories and previously learned information. And as Clive suffered severe damage to these areas of his brain, it has a devastating effect on the whole system of his brain, as well as having a massive impact on his quality of life. So we'll now look at the differences between the nervous systems. We'll start with the central nervous system. So the nervous system is made up of two main systems, which are the central nervous system, CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, PNS. The autonomic nervous system, ANS, is a branch of the motor division of the PNS and is made up of the sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and it consists of the sensory system and the motor system. It enables the transfer of information from the sensory system to the brain via the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are linked and are the base for all information processed between the brain, the muscular system, and the skeletal system. The spinal cord integrates nerve cells to and from the brain to the rest of the body and is constructed by nerves that are grouped around the central canal, which attach to the spinal nerves, which send information to and from the rest of the nervous system. The importance of the link between the brain and the spinal cord within the nervous system is crucial for the ability to successfully process information, and the removal of the hippocampus during the time Clyde had the virus gives evidence to support this, as this shows how our perception of everyday life is determined by neurological and nervous system processes. The peripheral nervous system communicates with the brain and the spinal cord and sends messages from sense and internal organs. The PNS consists of two branches, which are sensory afferent division and the motor efferent division. There are 31 pairs of peripheral spinal nerves which evolve from the spinal cord via spaces between the vertebrae of the spine. They each divide and subdivide into more branches which cover the entire body. In addition to the peripheral spinal nerves, there are a further 12 pairs of cranial nerves which connect to the brain directly. These nerves are involved with processing information detected by our senses. The ANS is made up of two agonistic divisions, which are the sympathetic, and which activates bodily functions, and increases heart pressure, blood pressure, the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands, and the parasympathetic system, which conserves energy by slowing heart rate, reducing blood pressure, and digest. The two subsystems work together to keep a continued internal balance known as homeostasis. This sympathetic system activates bodily responses and the parasympathetic system slows them down again. Both branches work together to integrate skeletal muscles with internal organs to react to perceived threats or incoming information. Physiological processes are a vital part of psychological studies, as cognitive neuroscience has revealed a link between physiology and higher mental processes, which can also be seen in the case of Clive Waring. By looking at the processes and transmission of information within the brain and the nervous system, and the damage found within Clive's brain, we can better understand his behaviour and the reasons why he has the difficulties he has. The communication between neurons. Neurons are found in bundles which make up the nerves in the nervous system. They are rope-like structures and transfer between the organs of the body and in between the tissue and spaces between the vertebrae of the spine. Each bundle of neurons is known as a fascicle, and nerves carry both sensory and motor neurons. A nerve is a very small structure, and the neurons which exist in bundles of fascicles are even smaller. So this puts into perspective the size of the tiny microglia that supports them. Neurons communicate through a mixture of electrical impulses and chemical substances known as neurotransmission. A neurotransmitter is a chemical substance which is released by one neuron to send information to the next neuron. The chemical substance is needed as neurons don't touch each other, as they are separated by the synaptic cleft or gap. Neurotransmitters enable signals to cross synapses to process information from nerve cell or neuron to a target cell. They coordinate behaviour by stimulating an action, and a single neuron can produce several different neurotransmitters. Familiar neurotransmitters include dopamine, GABA, glutamate, serotonin, and epinephrine, known as adrenaline. Nerve impulses are created by chemical changes in the cell body, which generates electrical charges called ions. Potassium ions inside the nerve cell cause a negative charge while sodium ions outside the cell body are positively charged, which creates the impulse along the axon of the neuron. At the end of the axon, neurotransmitter substance is released into the synaptic cleft, where it is received by binding receptors of the dendrites of the receiving neuron. This substance then triggers the next neuron to be stimulated the same as the previous one, and the message is transferred along the system. The neurotransmitter substance is then pushed back into the sending neuron by a reuptake mechanism, ensuring the right amount of information is sent forward. Communication between neurons can either be excitatory or inhibitory. This means they can either stimulate action or reduce overactivity. When the neurotransmitters reach the end of the synapse, neurotransmitter substances are released into the synaptic cleft or gap. Each different neurotransmitter is specially designed to bind certain receptor sites of the dendrite of the receiving neuron. The neurotransmitter substance does not pass down the receiving neuron, but its presence forms another action potential, which is a change to the chemical structures. So we'll now look at the difference between glial cells and neurons and the difference of their structure. Nervous tissue is made up of two parts known as neurons and glial cells. Neurons are the information pathway of the nervous system, and all sensory information processed to and from the brain is transferred by this system throughout the body. Glial cells act as the support system for neurons and provide them with nourishment and protection, and are the most important information transmitters in the body. Neurons all have the same basic structure but vary greatly in size and shape, while others extend almost as long as a leg. The three main structures of the neuron consist of the cell body, the axon, and the dendrites. The cell body contains a nucleus and it contains a Golgi body and mitochondria like other cells in the body. The axon is a long single nerve fibre that extends from the cell body along the whole length of the neuron. The function of the axon is to transmit signals away from the cell body. Dendrites are branched extensions of the nerve cell. They receive and send information to the cell body. In addition to these three basic structures, there are other sections which consist of the Schwann cell, nodes of Ranvier, axon terminals, and the synapse. The three main types of neurons are bipolar, multipolar, and unipolar, and there are far more of certain types than others. Neurons are specialised cells that control functions in the body. Their function is to either transfer information away from the sensory organs to the spinal cord and then to the brain, transfer information from the brain to the sensory organs or body tissues, and act as an intermediary in linking information coming from, going back to, or within the brain for accurate perception and appropriate action. There are three sorts of neurons, which are sensory, motor, efferent, and association, which is mixed. The human brain contains approximately 100 billion mixed neurons and axon and dendrite branches that extend and connect to more than 100 trillion points in the brain. They are also an essential part of the processing of information for the brain and the nervous system. And neurons are the main type of cell that is destroyed by Alzheimer's disease, which causes disruption on how the electrical charges travel along the axon itself and the activity of the neurotransmitter substances at synaptic transfer level between the axon and dendrite of the sending and receiving neurons. The effective function of these neurons is essential, as seen within the case of Clive. It can affect not just our psychological being, but our sense of self, memories, and relationships with others. Although Clive was able to recognise his wife and son, he couldn't recall his son's name, and unable to recognise people he knew before the illness. His senses of self has been badly affected, also as the inability to store new memories makes it impossible to build on his sense of self, to determine what he likes and decisions to make based on that. Glial cells' function is to provide an extensive support to neurons. They could be referred to as housekeeping cells and have an important function within the immune system and work with astrocytes to maintain the well-being of the neuron system in the brain. They transfer cerebral spinal fluid, and it's suggested that they influence the movement of the nutrients into the brain to help moving toxins. Now look at the three neurotransmitters in relation of the behaviours they influence. The six main neurotransmitters all have functions that influence our emotions and behaviour, and we know that a neurotransmitter is a chemical substance that acts at synaptic level in the nervous system, and that too much or little can cause several emotional and physical difficulties. So we will look in more detail at serotonin, dopamine, and CRF in relation to the behaviours, emotions that they produce. So serotonin is a transmitter involved with mood balance, and the highest levels are found in the gastrointestinal tract. It has a role in the appetite reduction and satiation, and has been linked with eating disorders such as anorexia. Serotonin is also involved with depression and anxiety perception. Dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter and influences a major part in motor coordination, memory, problem solving, and attention. It is also associated with the pleasure centre of the brain, especially desire and reward, which is why increased levels have driven addictive behaviour. It is also possible that dopamine is associated with heightened arousal or alertness, which would be useful in potential stressful situations. Disruption of dopamine receptors has been linked with Parkinson's disease and some symptoms of schizophrenia. This forms psychosis in individuals experiencing schizophrenia. Evidence which supports this is the dopamine receptors offer relief from psychotic symptoms to individuals who are experiencing psychosis. Corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF, is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter. It's directly involved in the stress response, and its main function is to activate the HPA axis by stimulating the pituitary gland to make the hormone ATCH, which is the trigger for the endocrine system to produce adrenaline as part of the fight or flight process to stress increased. Increased production also has been linked to depression and Alzheimer's disease. Other functions relate to prenatal issues and rapid increase on the onset of labour. Now, there are several drugs which influence neurotransmitters' actions and affect how we think, feel, and behave. Agonists increase the actions of neurotransmitters and often mimic their actions. Antagonists or blockers interfere or stop the actions. Mechanisms for antagonist and antagonist drug action at synaptic level are summarised in the following diagram shown here. From the image, it's possible to understand better how the drugs affect neurotransmitters to elicit changes in brain functioning and behaviour. Neurotransmitters being related to how the brain interprets the signals from the body via the nervous system. These signals create emotional behavioural responses that the brain interprets as appropriate. So as we can see, as it says here on the image, antagonist drugs can increase the release of neurotransmitters, whereas antagonist drugs can block the release of neurotransmitters. Now, as seen within the presentation, the importance of the hippocampus is crucial for memory recall and learning. The absence of this within the brain areas all affect within the limbic system's functioning normally. The destruction of this area of Clive's brain also shows a negative effect of the processes within other parts of the nervous system, as well as abnormal neurotransmission levels. As the brain is such a complex system, we can accept that by studying the areas affected within Clive's brain and associated behaviour portrayed, we can better understand and learn more about the functions and processes of the brain and the nervous system, and the importance of the hippocampus to memory. Thanks for listening.